So welcome everyone. I'm very, very happy to see you all. I'm very happy to have my colleagues, Barbara and Ian, joining us today. I'm very, very happy to have Ian, and he's gonna tell some amazing news in a second. But welcome to our IMC webinar. This is a topic that a lot of you have asked for, and now we found an expert that's going to tell some general ideas of humanitarian mediation, and then he will open the floor so you can start and ask your questions. Enjoy the time. And Ian, I will leave the floor to you so you can share the news.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Marion. I much appreciate it, and a warm welcome to everybody who's joining us today. So yes, as of the 1st of March, I am now the new director of the International Mediation Campus. So I'm joining this fantastic organisation, of which obviously I've been training with for a while now, but a huge privilege to be part of it, and really looking forward to what we're going to do with it in the future. And I thought it might just be worth saying a couple of things up front, is that we are going to expand quite a bit the course offer and the way that we look at doing things. So you can expect this year to see an advanced mediation course being introduced towards the latter part of the year. And you can also expect to see a negotiation course. So we're going to start doing negotiation training as well. And there will be other things we develop over the next 3 to 5 years. We have a 10-year strategy which we're working towards. And our intention is to provide for you, the community, some really excellent opportunities, which I think you'll enjoy with some top people. But we also want to try and help alumni as well, who have been through our training programs, to help them perhaps get some work in some areas where we can use their skills in the longer term as well, so connections in the right way. So that's really what we're looking at, which is really exciting. We've got a new look website as well coming out in a while, so it's all go at the moment. I'm still finding my feet, so I'm still a bit like a rabbit in the headlights, but getting there. So it's very exciting. But to be with all of you, and many people, of course, I know for over the last couple of years. So I've been asked to speak today about. I'll just share my screen with you, actually, if I may. I've been asked to speak about the spectrum of humanitarianism and really give some ideas and some insights based on my own experience. But I know a lot of you also have a lot of experience in different fields, and particularly some of you in the humanitarian field as well. So these are just ideas, and what we've tentatively called it navigating mediation across the full humanitarian spectrum. So what I'm going to do is just throw some ideas out there. One or two of them you might have seen in some of the work that we've done together before, but a lot of it's quite new. And it's really just my thoughts on the humanitarian spectrum. I mean, basically, I think humanitarians are a little bit lost at the moment. There's an amazing number of humanitarian actors doing some incredible work. A lot of that work is often siloed, is often stovepiped. We are at our best when we work together, and in some circumstances it does happen, but not always. And I think one of the issues is actually, what is a humanitarian? I mean, in real terms. So what does that actually mean? I'm going to cover 4 themes today. The first one is about political agreements in conflict-affected areas. I'll just tell you a little bit about my experience in that field. A little bit about strengthening coordination, how we might do that better between humanitarian agencies and stakeholders. A bit about overcoming barriers to aid delivery and ensuring access to affected communities. And that's probably one of the most difficult things to do in the modern era. And then the role of mediation in protecting civilians and addressing human security concerns. Particularly important when we look at the terrible things that are happening in Ukraine and obviously Gaza, but also we often forget, Sudan and Myanmar, and of course Burundi and Congo. There are many different areas where conflict is still ongoing, and they tend to be slightly out of sight, particularly to the Western world. But these conflicts are going on, and they are very, very significant conflicts with terrible loss of life in some of them. So the first question for you, and I thought I'd throw it to the audience first, is what do you think a humanitarian is? That's the first question. So I'm going to throw that open to the floor. If anybody has any views, what do you think a humanitarian is? It's a very difficult question to answer. It's not as easy as people think. So does anybody have any ideas on what a humanitarian actually is? How would you describe a humanitarian? And if,
Can I say something?
yeah, sure.
Okay, so I think from what I've learned, if I remember correctly, from my university, which is a longer than I would like to admit, humanitarian is going there where rights are being, I forget the word, damaged, I would say, or where people have no power to get out of a difficult situation. So it's aiding people in a certain way. That's
Okay, that's a good start. Yeah, that's a very good start. Thank you, Mariana, for that. And that we'll come back to that in a minute when I talk about some possible definitions. Ole.
Thank you, Jan. I would try not to give kind of definition, but I would try to describe my life experience of humanitarians organization playing their role in Ukraine conflict that started actually 11 years ago. And it started in the eastern part of Ukraine, where I'm from. So I faced this conflict 11 years ago. And there, my mother worked in humanitarian organization. And I saw it like some guys with arms, with weapon, are killing each other, and it's not a big deal for them if the civilian would suffer from this. The humanitarians try to save people in this difficult situation, to save their lives, to provide food, clothes to the places where there is no another source of food, where it is not enough, there is no another source of money to buy food. So they are supplying people by food, by some necessities, and yes, like toothpaste, like toilet paper, and etc. So like soap. It's difficult to imagine to me. It was difficult to imagine to me as a person who lived in a world without war between before 2014, that some things like soap, some clothes, they are so important for people to feel like people, like human being, not like animals, without these necessities. And humanitarians help people, they provide these things, and they help people to stay, to feel like people in these hard conflicts and human conflicts.
There's some very good points there, which I'll come back to some of those in a minute. Jacques, you've been very patient.
Now, Ian, thanks. I shared my comment in the group. Perhaps at its core, a humanitarian is anyone, for that matter, who ultimately cares for the needs of another who is in dire need of help, and then regardless of the context, because we have often context of war, we have context of natural disasters, we would have a context of political turmoil, whatever the case might be. So regardless of context, at its core, a basic message is that a humanitarian can be anyone really who cares for the basic needs of another, where that person, when he or she can't, himself or herself.
I think we're getting to the nub of it there very much. So yeah, thank you, Jack, for that. I'll come back in a second. Noman, my friend.
So humanitarian individual or organization is any entity, person that provides marginalized and affected communities with basic human needs in post-conflict environment where the government has disbanded or collapsed, the institution has collapsed, the basic needs are not there, and the people which are affected needs some sort of aid, either through food, social welfare, to restore the environment for their benefit. And also there is reintegrating those societies back into the social context as well.
Thanks, Noman. So some very good answers there. And I think I'm going to give you two examples of definitions. So the first one, I'll get this right, here we go, is a humanitarian is a person who seeks to promote human welfare. So the things that Ole mentioned, the things that Noman mentioned, the things that Jacques mentioned, it's basically we are there, most of us are humanitarians, we want to promote human welfare, we want people to be treated fairly, equally, but the context in which we normally deliver that is often conflict or disaster or something that has affected those communities. But basically it is human welfare, and it's quite wide. It's quite a wide description. I was fiddling around with different definitions. I put several in today into ChatGPT and saw what they might come back with, which I thought would be interesting to see. And they came up with the things I inputted. They came up with a very good overall definition. A humanitarian is someone who is actively engaged in promoting the well-being of others, to Jacques' point, often through charitable work, the point you were making, Ole, disaster relief, social justice initiatives, Noman, the point that you were making, or advocacy for human rights, which you all made. And they prioritize alleviating suffering, improving living conditions, and supporting those in need, regardless of race, nationality, or background, which again comes back to points that all of you have raised. So really the 2 points about it is this. I tend to look at it simply as the promotion of human welfare, but based on that second definition, it's clearly a spectrum. It's not just one aspect. And so different humanitarian organizations do different parts of that jigsaw puzzle. They fit, but do they all fit together in the right way? That is the big issue of 21st century humanitarianism. It's connecting people properly in the right way. So there's a more holistic approach to the way that it could be delivered. We base our humanitarianism on 4 basic principles, which all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. But I'm going to question 2 of them because they're all right, but they're correct. But it's just in the modern era, are we truly focusing on the right thing? So humanity, absolutely. That's the gist of humanitarianism. Human suffering is addressed wherever it is found, whatever side it is. We address it where people are suffering. Neutrality. Humanitarian actors do not take sides in hostilities. Independence, not subordinated yet to the fighting. So we work to our organization and to our organization's principles, which are these basically. And finally, impartiality. We're guided on the basis of need alone. So even if you have to operate in an area, for example, which is seen by everybody as the enemy on the other side, depending on your perspective, you still have to go there and support people because they're suffering in that context, which makes life very difficult. The one of those 4 principles, the one that actually is perhaps the most difficult is actually neutrality. And it's difficult not because we're taking sides, but humanitarianism implies a very clear understanding of human rights. And if people's human rights are being affected, then clearly we're advocating for those human rights to be protected. So if you're saying to a government that is oppressing somebody in part of their country that they shouldn't be doing that, you're automatically seen as not being neutral, even though it's the right thing to do because you're advocating that they should behave to certain standards, but you won't be seen as neutral. And that becomes a big problem in the humanitarian world. And it's something we'll come back to again in a minute. The other is impartiality. Again, we are impartial, but sometimes that impartiality is challenged by both parties. So, for example, in the Myanmar context, which I've been working on recently, if people deliver aid to communities through the regime that is in Myanmar, the military regime, they are seen as supporting that regime. That's the impression that people have, even though that's not the case. They just need the aid to get to those communities who just happen to be on the other side of the fence. So sometimes that can affect the way that we conduct our operations and the way that we are perceived. So the spectrum, I would suggest, the late and great Kofi Annan in 2000 did a lot of work on human security. And I think the human security model, which the UN uses, is actually quite a useful basis for thinking about what that spectrum is. So in the human security model, it's really based around 3 things: the provision of security, development, so economy and social development, human rights. But at the center of it is the idea of justice. And that's justice not in the legal sense as we know, but it's basically fairness and transparency. Obviously justice in terms of legal as well, but fairness, transparency, and being treated equally with your fellow compatriots. And so the model works well that those 3 elements, security, preventing violence, development, giving a good economy, jobs, etc., human rights, making sure there are no abuses, those 3 things develop that feeling of justice, that feeling of security, inner security that we have. And in the world that we work in, what does human rights actually mean? Well, Kofi Annan again said freedom from want, freedom from fear. Actually, for the historians among you, in 1942, Franklin Roosevelt was trying to explain to Congress what we were fighting for in World War II. And he said, we're fighting for freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of speech, and freedom of worship. And I think that's absolutely true. You can get a film of it on YouTube if you want to see him actually delivering it. But I would also add on freedom of identity as well onto that list in the modern era, because identity is also important, both as an individual and a national, regional level as well. And then from security side, we're talking about political security, because political security, without political security, you don't get the security blanket, you don't get the right policies. So the political settlement and accommodation and settlement are the 2 most important things for delivering that overall sense of justice. Food security, which most humanitarians focus on, economic and health security, environmental security, and they all cross over between these different elements, and your own personal security and community security, all of which are affected by human rights abuses, lack of development, lack of proper security, which creates the conditions of violence. So my point is, I think that for the 21st century, we should really be thinking very clearly around this human security model and trying to work out where all the jigsaw pieces fit together, which will help us in our dealings at each level. And again, I take the simple definition is a person who seeks to promote human welfare. We want the best for the people in that affected community, wherever that may be. The spectrum, therefore, is political space, primary goal, the creation of a dialogue space that leads to conflict management, transformation and resolution through non-violent approaches. And that's the key. The politics is about getting non-violent approaches to dealing with the situation. The second level is the humanitarian delivery space, the point that you were making earlier about delivering humanitarian support when needed, often across divides. And I was in Bosnia in the 1990s. This is difficult sometimes. Food and water, security, shelter, medical. People forget, health, medical and health. So it's not just medical interventions, but health as well. Pandemics, epidemics, etc. Education. So again, in the Myanmar context, Thailand has taken a lot of students from Myanmar into their school system because they need education to be the force of the future that provides that sort of social and economic security and community resilience. The security space, okay? The security space, but having been a peacekeeper myself as well in the past, it's about reducing the causes of violence and protecting communities from the effects of violence. But it is intensely political, because unless you get the right political agreement and buy-in, you can't have the ceasefire, you can't demarcate between the armed factions, you can't deliver aid and security, for the economic and physical security on the ground in terms of food and shelter. So effective security is essential for long-term political accommodation and settlement. The economic space, what have people got to look forward to bring them out of violence, to bring them out of the situation they're in? We need a sustainable and effective economy. It provides the money that you need to build and give people a roof over their head and work to do. The social space, and this is a key thing here, I think, is recognizing the needs of the whole community with inclusive programs for peace and safety and reconciliation over time. That's the most difficult thing, reconciliation. But also affecting, as you said, Noman, communities against marginalization, making sure they're not marginalized in that way. And the final one, again, in that spectrum, these are my own ideas, but my final one I think is very important, is the environmental space. And we often forget about that. So we can save the people, we can look after them, but if we haven't protected their environment, how are they going to sustain themselves? We need to look after that environment and make sure long-term that it is. One of the fascinating things about the now defunct Myanmar peace process is when we were actually doing it up until 2021, it was one of the very unusual peace processes, along with Colombia, I think, and I'm pretty certain Guatemala, one of the very few that actually had climate and the environment written into the peace accords and the protection of that for the long-term economic benefit of the community, but also the protection of that lovely environments that they lived in. So when we design mediation, this humanitarian space, and I think one or two I may have shared this with you before, but I think the key thing is to do a conflict analysis. And when I say conflict, I don't necessarily mean conflict in terms of armed conflict, but what is actually happening to that community. And I think there are always five basic questions, five core questions. The first one is, what is the current context? What's happening now? If it's a tsunami, it's a tsunami. It's happened now. That's the context. But then what is happening right now that we need to change? The context is it's blown, it's destroyed this town, it's destroyed this city. What do we need to do now? We have to change that environment to make it better for the people who are there. And the key one is, who are the key stakeholders? And that's not just the stakeholders involved in that conflict, but who are the humanitarian stakeholders that can actually help with that change? And we very rarely properly map out, we all have our own silos, we very rarely properly map out collectively what all the other agencies are doing and how we can work together. It's a difficult thing to do sometimes. What behaviors do we want to see happen to make that change? And the most important thing is, how are we going to get there? Who do we influence to make that change actually happen? So for me, this is the simple framework. I've used this for many years, but it's just a simple framework I wrote on the back of a notebook, I don't know, 20 years ago. And I've always followed this because the key thing is, for me, the key thing is understanding what's happening right now, who the stakeholders are, and how do I influence them to change their behaviors to deliver an effect. So I think this is very important in the overall context of humanitarianism. So top 5 global humanitarian situations, ? Conflicts and displacement, and we've mentioned Ukraine in particular, Gaza, Sudan, Myanmar, Congo, Burundi, Rwanda, that area. Food insecurity and famine, very common throughout Africa, sadly. Natural disasters and climate change impacts. Health crises and epidemics, there will be another one, I'm sure. We're better prepared than we were for the last one, but nevertheless, it still will probably happen again. Human rights violations and access restrictions. These are all common global humanitarian situations, all of which are ongoing at the moment in different areas of the world. So the key to that, of course, I mentioned about actor mapping, but we need to map out those actors. What is our entry point to dealing with people, and how do we influence them? And it's far better as humanitarians if we work together to collaborate to actually achieve that influence on them, to make that change. It's far more effective. It was starting to happen in the Myanmar peace process I was working. We did have regular meetings. We had a monthly international agencies used to get to work once a month to try and work out who was doing what, and then try and support each other where we could. But there are 2 things to bear in mind. I think the first thing is, who are the people who are actually in conflict, who are actually affected by the conflict? So who's fighting each other? Who's physically affected by the conflict? Always the civilian population. And who's actually able to influence peace? So those are 3 categories I think we need to think about very carefully. And the second is that it's different lived realities and experiences of conflict. So Ole, your point you were making earlier on, and Noman as well, is that, if you are from a different ethnic community and the other community doesn't like you, then your perspective is going to be very different to the other community. If you're an international person, your perspective, because you're being parachuted in to look at that situation new, is not the same. As Kofi Annan again famously said, never expect to arrive in a country and think you know it as well as the people who live there. It's impossible. You're not a native to that country. You'll never see it in the same perspective. So those different needs, perceptions, approaches we need to take account of. Many of you are familiar with this, the levels of mediation negotiation. So the key thing for us is, as humanitarians, what level are we working at? And most of the things you were talking about, Ole and Noman, that is really levels 2 and 3. It's what we call track 2 and 3. It's very much at the governmental side as a country and regional leadership, but also grassroots particularly. A lot of the political space, the Ukraine situation, for example, it's 1 and 1.5 is where a lot of that negotiation is taking place at the moment. That's where it should be, because it's formal negotiation process with informal processes feeding that behind in the background. But often in conflict situations, actually the grassroots is where you understand the situation, which then allows us as humanitarians delivering aid, doing things we need to do, to then influence that top level leadership. So it's not simply a case of saying we'll focus on track 1. We need to focus across the whole spectrum, but some humanitarians only focus on 1 or 1.5, some only focus on track 3. So it's how do you connect all of those together so that you get the whole picture? That's what we should be really thinking about in the 21st century. I would also say that when it comes to the political side, there are always four transition blocks. The first one is the engagement, reaching out to talk to people, building trust and confidence between the conflict actors. And that can take a very long time, or it can take a very short time. It depends on the situation. The difficult bit is actually accommodation. And you will, Noman and Ole will remember when they did the webinar we did together, simulation a while back, actually building that trust between the different parties so they can actually say, look, this is the common ground. These are things that we actually agree on, making some compromises. What takes a lot longer is the settlement. So you've got the accommodation, you agree on the main building blocks, and that can take months, years. But getting a settlement where you have an actual accord, a peace accord, or a structure that allows you to deliver that humanitarian aid or deliver that security, prevent violence from happening, that takes a while. The most difficult thing is the whole reconciliation process, which takes a very long time. Now, I know, Conscious Jagger, you from South Africa at the moment, but I think one of the things I often talk about is the huge success of the initial South African peace process between 1989 and 1996. And it's an amazing blueprint. There are still difficulties to this day, but the whole point, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the whole reconciliation, Truth and Reconciliation Committee, etc., all of those things, you have to buy, the community has to buy into it. And if you have the right structures in place, and I think South Africa, the model is an excellent one. It's not, it's not perfect. It has like all peace process, you want a racing horse and you all sit around the table and you design, what's the perfect racing horse? So it's got long legs, it can go the long distance, and you end up, when you see the picture, it's actually a camel. It's a horse that's been designed by a committee. But at least it gets over the line though, and that's the key thing. Will it actually get over the line? And it may be better. It may not look as attractive as a sleek racehorse, but actually it's got a hump, it's got water, it can last a bit longer. It might be a bit faster and go through the night, So it might not be perfect, but it works. And that's the thing with reconciliation processes. It takes time and effort to really make those things work. On the humanitarian operating space in conflict, the people, as Ole said, they really suffer very badly in conflict. And the thing is, they're like a football. They're bounced around, aren't they? So they go where the security is. It might be the national government. It might be one of the armed groups. It might be the local government, or it might be national security forces. But somewhere in there, those people are being bounced around trying to find where that security is, because they need to be protected in some way. And that's why we have lots of IDPs and refugees, because they're not safe in that environment. So it could be another country, compete in another country. The point is that you, as a humanitarian, we have to follow where the people are. And so if it's IDPs internally within the country, if it's refugees, using cross-border discussions between different countries, it's a very complicated space. But we have to follow that. And sometimes I say that's when often our impartiality and our neutrality might possibly be challenged because of that. Common humanitarian scenarios: access to camps, access to prisoners, delivery of humanitarian aid, shelter, water, food, health, access to movement and routes, civilian protection, movement of IDPs and refugees, including repatriation as well. Who is going to enable us to fulfill that human security, and for what period of time? And that's what they will be thinking, but that's also what we should be thinking as well. Who can actually best provide for them in that time frame? And can we actually work with them? That's the other question. You mentioned earlier about oppression and doing bad things. There are some groups you just can't work with. It's just not possible, because it will make the situation worse. I would argue, and again, this is another back of a fag packet writing down some ideas many years back. What are the main areas for humanitarian negotiation? I call it arcs. There are really four main areas. One is access. It's negotiating our access to deliver that aid. The second is resources, the aid itself. The third is control. How do we control that? Do we have control over it? So if they say, well, you can deliver it, but you have to have an armed escort from us, but no, we can't do that. We need to control what we're doing. It can't be in your vehicles. It needs to be in our vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. And the fourth one, is security. So it's protecting not just yourselves, but most importantly, the people that you're actually working with. You need to make sure that they are safe. And it's all balanced by levels of risk against those humanitarian principles. And sometimes we do have to make some uncomfortable compromises from time to time. But we must never forget this promotion of that human welfare is the key to all of that. I think there are 8 core themes of facilitating humanitarian aid. The first one is positive action, and that's the most important one to me, that the action is positive and we do something. Defining the need of the target areas, identifying the stakeholders, identifying the resources. What resources do you have? And if you can pool those resources from other elements and bring it all together, that is ideal. Understanding the art of the possible, being realistic. Sometimes you can't do things. It's just not possible. And you've got to accept that. Don't strike it off. There may be a time when you can do that. Keep that idea in mind, but it might not be possible at that point in time. Expectation management. This is very difficult within communities as to what can be delivered and what can't be delivered. Advocating, that constant in the background all the time, both confidential and public, advocating for action and resources. In the political space of humanitarianism, this is what we, political actors, spend a lot of time doing this, is advocating for governments to think and do things in a different way. And of course, stakeholder management. So these are just 8 core themes, I think, for facilitating humanitarian aid, which are worth thinking about. And just to finish off with a couple of things, I think the first one is the importance of facilitation. So we talk a lot about mediation, a lot about negotiation. Sometimes we are not the mediators. Sometimes as humanitarians, we're not the negotiators, but we know the people who should be, and we can help them to do that. We can actually help them facilitate to do that. So it really depends on the nature of the character of the conflict or the situation. And many of those actors are very complicated. They're very complex. Misunderstandings can happen. So what we can do is we can source and influence others to support what a government, for example, is trying to do, or what a particular group is trying to do. We can facilitate networks to deliver humanitarian supplies. We can facilitate the implementation of that. We can connect them, connect those actors together. We can monitor and mediate between the different groups having their discussions where it's actually needed, but they still will conduct their own overall negotiation. And most importantly, a lessons learned process. So at the end of all of that, as you go through each turn of the handle, what have we learned this time that we can use better next time to oil those wheels that make the machinery work a bit better? I'm going to finish with one thing, which is to kind of illustrate the really difficulty of this. So in 2021, Indonesia, which has been an amazing friend of the people of Myanmar for many years now, they persuaded the ASEAN countries to come up with a 5-point consensus on Myanmar. And this was in Jakarta. And they basically put on there 5 things: immediate end to violence, inclusive dialogue, the appointment of a special envoy, humanitarian assistance by ASEAN, and a visit by the regional bloc special envoy to meet with all the parties in the country. If you analyse that, it really comes down to the 3 things we've been talking about: end violence, provide humanitarian assistance, and peace dialogue. And to me, those 3 things are the crux of what humanitarianism is all about. It's creating an environment where there is no violence, or limited, or violence, at least violence. I mean, all of us know from the countries that we live in that you can never completely eradicate violence. There'll always be society naturally, there are natural tendencies towards violence. But as long as it can be contained within normal law and order processes, by having unarmed police that can deal with that situation, somebody's drunk in a pub on a Saturday night, they can be locked up, talked to, released the next day. It's dealt with properly through due justice and a proper system, and the majority of people are safe, then we've achieved something quite significant. And there's a due legal process that takes into account all the things that have happened, and it goes through a legal system. Humanitarian assistance, the delivery of, critically important, especially in areas, for example, affected by natural disasters or in conflict itself. And of course, peace dialogue, because without that dialogue over time, you won't create the conditions that will end that violence long term, and you won't create the conditions that allows that humanitarian assistance to go forward. And I think that's it. There were just a few thoughts I wanted just to chuck out there, put my contact details there in case everyone's to contact me. We'll open the floor now for sort of discussions about it. Just a few thoughts there on really the humanitarian space as we see it. And I really do believe in those 3 final things I mentioned. I think it is about ending violence, protecting people. It is about being able to provide humanitarian assistance. And it is about peace dialogue. But the final thing I say about peace dialogue, going back to that human security model, the peace dialogue and the long-term peace processes is all about providing those elements of human security that allows us to, we the people affected by that, to feel secure and safe with a sense of self-agency, a sense of owning our own future, but actually that the system looks after us. We collectively as a community, we are safe. We've got equal rights. We're considered the same in all shapes and forms. There's no intrinsic biases. It's inclusive, depending on all the different communities working together. So that's what we're aiming for. It's always, in some ways, it's a perfect dream. It's not, you're never going to get it exactly there to where you want it to be. It can be changed by culture and lots of different things as well. But that's really what we should be striving for. And I think in the 21st century, we as humanitarians, the key thing that we need to do is to collaborate better. And it's also understand what each of us does and where we can actually fit that jigsaw puzzle together to deliver a better effect. It's never going to be perfect. There will always be things and little political things that pull it left, right and centre. But nevertheless, if we can get the bulk of people agreeing to that, agencies agreeing to the right way of doing things, then we have a better chance of delivering much more accurate humanitarian effect. So I'll throw the floor open to you, and let's please have a hopefully a hearty discussion on it. I'm not saying I'm necessarily right, but that's just my views at the moment. Noman, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to ask your experience of Afghanistan, since you have been to Afghanistan and your role was more of a peacekeeper there, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, in your observation, the humanitarian assistance which was there, the different aids organization working there. So, what challenges that you observed those people faced in that environment? Because Afghanistan is a very tough country, regardless of the people, the language, and the tradition that they have, strong traditions. Keeping that in mind, how did they effectively provide the assistance in that particular area?
Yeah, certainly, Noman. Yeah. So just so people are aware, I spent over 2 years in Afghanistan, and the first period was between 2003 and 2005. I was a battalion commander in northern Afghanistan, and we were working with the provincial reconstruction teams up there. So we were basically providing that security for that kind of aid delivery and the disarmament process. We were in the process of disarming all the old Soviet equipment, etc. And then later on, I was in Iraq in between, but later on I went back as the chief mentor at the Afghan Officer Academy, but for 15 months between 2015 and 2016. So I saw a very different perspective there, training young women, men and women for the Afghan National Army. So the first thing I should say, Noman, and I've said this to you before, but I love Afghanistan as a place, and the people are pretty amazing in my experience. So it's a tragedy, what has happened over the last 20 years during our period, obviously, before that, and of course what is happening now. So I have very mixed feelings, because on one side, when I was first there, 2003, 4, and 5, it was my intent for my particular mission to do, I made all the soldiers ask themselves every day, what have we done for Afghanistan today? That was the key question. What have we actually done here, which helps the people of Afghanistan? It was key for us. That's what we were there to do. And we were quite successful, I think, in those first couple of years. And I think the big mistake came 2006, when we expanded into Nimroz and Oruzgan, etc., which most of us felt we shouldn't have done. We didn't really feel there was any need to go any further west from where we were, because it was a very small mission. There weren't many people there. We were there based on helping the UN and other agencies deliver things and build up the security forces for Afghanistan to take control of its own destiny. That's really what we were focused on. And that all changed after 2006. So how do we deliver that? I think the key thing was, in my case, it was Governor Atta in Mazar Sharif at the time. He was the boss. I mean, he was the governor. And so everything we did was about supporting him, the legitimate government of that area. And so we asked permission for every time that we did something. We would go to him, to his office, and say, right, this is, you've asked that you want some support here, or we've got some ideas that might be useful for you. What do you think? And we'd always discuss it with his team, or at least the provincial reconstruction team commander did. And then my task was to go out and support the security that delivered that in those different areas. So it was very much under Afghan control rather than our control in that sense. We also we did some good things, which were very interesting. I think one of the other things I think is most important is that you should always focus locally and get local people to do things. So I had a brilliant captain, Gurkha captain, who did a couple of tours there. And in those tours, he made many contacts. And he managed to get us a budget of $9 million for one battalion to rebuild destroyed and broken schools in Kabul. And over a period of 18 months, even after we left, they were still doing it. 17 schools were reconfigured, rebuilt. We had the hospital there, the Maywan Hospital. They built a special antenatal facility there and for other bits and pieces with that money. But everything was done by locals. So we were providing an engineer foreman to go down there and oversee it. We worked with local companies. We didn't pay, they were paid to do the work, but it was all done properly officially through government channels, everything else. So they got the pay, proper contracts, everything else, but it was all local. So you'd have maybe one or two soldiers there who were engineers overseeing the whole process, but everything was owned by them. So I think this, as Americans call it, by, with and through, that was actually the right approach to do. They were reconstructing their own country and doing it themselves and doing it very proudly. So I think that was a very important thing for us. But I think the most important thing is that it's local ownership. If you don't have local ownership, if you're not supporting a local mission, then it's not going to work. And I think that's what happened over time. Is that, and I'm not political at all, but President Karzai was very determined he wanted control of the whole country. And the danger with that is, from my perspective, as a personal view, the danger with that is that he could have had control of the whole country. He could have. My personal view is that he probably would have been better off saying that Nimroz, Uruzgan, Kandahar, and Helmand should be federated tribal areas rather like in Pakistan. So it's a tribal area. You run yourselves under an administrator with a governor maybe, and you run it that way. It could have been done with local Afghan forces alone over time, but it wasn't. And we expanded as NATO. And the moment you do that, you then looked at as invading forces. That's how it's seen from the perspective of local people there. So that then made our situation very, very tough to do that. And most of us felt that it wasn't the right move at that particular time to do that, that we could have done a much smaller template and done everything through the Afghan government and got them to expand in that way. And the other criticism I would give of us as an international community is sure, at 25 years ago, Afghanistan, Nepal, I spent a lot of time in Nepal, India, lots of places, there's always bakshish, there's always a little bit, the policeman will always ask for a few rupees here or there, or a few notes here or there. But what we did as an international community, we put so much money into Afghanistan, so much money, that the level of corruption just went through the roof. I mean, it was staggering how much corruption was there. And that was not clever. We should have thought very, very, very carefully about how we spent that money. And we should have thought very carefully at the avenues that we used it for to support Afghanistan in a better way. So I think my direct criticism, we were very wasteful of the money that we used there, is my view. Hopefully that answered that. Yeah. Jacques, sorry, yeah.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I mean, thank you for those amazing insights. I think just on what you said about local ownership, perhaps, I mean, just from what I want to see, one of those little forgotten corners of the world is what's going on in Somalia. Keeps dragging on, and local ownership is such a tough nut to crack in that part of the world. What I want to get to, Ian, is I really, and he, in a humanitarian aid sense, I really enjoyed the principles you elucidated on, but it's amazing how one of the topics you touched on, expectation management and the management of the expectations of the different parties to the negotiations, or basically sitting around the table. It's so important. And I mean, this filters right through from any kind of like track 1, track 2 negotiation, right down to something even much, much more simple, like a company boardroom, or like what we have in South Africa is called the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation, and Arbitration, and it's mainly focused on basically the settlement of labor law disputes. But it's a very nice way of bringing in the settlement of disputes before they kind of get elevated into a more formal legal sense. And the management of expectations is just, I mean, it's absolutely crucial. And I've been very fortunate in my own little path on finding you tonight in this amazing webinar, is that I've worked personally with former President de Klerk long after the negotiations in South Africa's transition from apartheid to a basically a functional democracy were settled. But remembering him, one of these things, and that's why I raise it with you tonight in this webinar, is he consistently raised, and I mean, you can imagine, and as you are very, very used to, the kind of high level negotiations, and even And especially there, he always made the point that that was in South Africa's negotiation, in our transition. It was absolutely crucial to manage the expectations of all the parties at CODESA, and in the negotiations going forward. And really, I mean, even in a basic employee context, in a boardroom context, in a court and next mediation context, or sitting with tribal elders around a tree on upended paint cans, you know, somewhere in the bush. It's amazing how valuable it is to learn very quickly and early on to never make promises that you are not going to be able to keep. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion. That thing of don't overextend yourself. You are putting the parties under pressure to the negotiation, but you're also putting yourself and your team that's with you under immense pressure if you overextend yourself. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add that.
No, thanks, Jack. I agree, and I think that's what we did, Noman, in Afghanistan. Exactly that. We overextended ourselves to a degree that we didn't need to do that. And left over to Clerk. Actually, I've always been a huge fan of his. I feel he's one of these people rather understated, because the courage it took to do what he did and to bring that process about is pretty extraordinary. Two great men, obviously Mandela as well, but the two of them together, it takes huge courage to do that. And sometimes, often, one thing I didn't say is often in humanitarian processes or in peace processes in particular, if you don't have that strong person, if you don't have a unifying person to bring them together, it's very difficult. And that's one of the problems they face in the Myanmar context, because there's no single unifying person. 22 different armed groups, and these are big groups. I mean, some of them 30,000 troops, some 10,000 troops. I mean, these are huge groups, and there's no one single leader for all of those entities that could actually do that negotiation. So in the South Africa context, I think the courage of those two in particular to come together, and then actually why I like the model very much, it is about local ownership, local peace committees, regional peace committees, your regional development, and economic development groups, the whole legal system that went with that to address grievances. It was very cleverly thought out, and it's something I think could be exported very, very well elsewhere. Ole.
Yeah, I would like to thank you for this amazing webinar, and especially for this pyramid of negotiation levels, because it's new for me. And now I have an insight about what happened in Ukraine. To my opinion, what I've seen and what I felt, that in 2014, and from 2014 maybe to 2022, the levels 2 and 3 worked quite well. So humanitarian organizations invested a lot of resources, financial and people's resources, to build this quite safe situation in the regions which bordered with the conflict line. And me, as a person who were relocated, I relocated to Kyiv from Lugansk 2014. I felt like I would like to see more efforts at the higher levels, not to froze this conflict and make this just a gray zone, yeah, where my home is situated, so I can't go back home. I've lost my home. And because of this zone is gray, and if maybe I've seen these efforts more powerful, maybe there were efforts, but they were not public, they were not official, and it was not a very good feeling of being just person from a person whose home was made a buffer zone, a gray zone. Yeah. And now I see that yes, the level 1 and level 1.5, thank you for highlighting this, now is working quite intensively, and I feel satisfaction about this. But now it's about negotiation, and now it's maybe sometimes I could go home, just wave my hand to my house and go back to the place which I now identify like my home. But it's about my freedom. And maybe only this level 1 and level 1.5 can really make this true. And thank you for highlighting this. I would like to just make some reflection about this, and it's very powerful for me just understanding this situation by this level. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Oli. Thank you. I would say just one other thing I want to add to that is that actually where countries are fragmenting, so if you think about Bosnia in the 1990s, if you think about Myanmar now, if you think about Burundi, you think about Democratic Republic of the Congo, often, armed groups sometimes hold territory. They hold it for many years. So I've spoken to and worked with armed groups who've been in Myanmar holding territory for 75 years in opposition to the, so that's their territory. They have their own police, they have their own system, their own structure. That balance between the top 1 and 1.5 discussions, the political process, but actually securing that bottom level. So allowing them to use the structures they have in place for governance, etc., to keep the non-violence there within the territory which they hold, is also important. So sometimes you see this balance between the two, where if a country is fragmenting, the bottom bit actually, they start to secure themselves. And then if you can then mediate, negotiate between them to bring them to keep more solidarity while that political process is going on, then you've got the basis of some kind of democratic system in the future, by putting in those basic measures: non-violence, humanitarian access, basic rule of law and governance, basic police at the lower level. So it's trying to balance those, I think, which is very important. Marlon, sorry, you've been very good to see you again. It's been very patient as well. Yeah, please, far away.
Thank you, Ian. Well, first of all, let me congratulate you in your new position. That's really, really good news.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this. Thank you.
That's excellent. So thank you for the whole presentation. It's very insightful, really. And it took me down memory lane for my own humanitarian work, and it reminded me of my first mission that was with UNHCR back in the day in Albania, 99, and we had huge movement of people. We couldn't keep track of them. That was our main problem as UNHCR, that they were moving so fast in and so fast out that it was a complete chaos. And then the lack of coordination, of course, because then you had your NGOs, your international NGOs, leaving behind their beneficiaries because they were following the money back into Kosovo at the time. And so they basically left difficult people like small children or handicapped people or elderly people. They simply left them behind, which was very, very shocking to see. So yeah, thank you for all of that. Now, I really applaud what I'm getting the gist of the whole thing of you are attempting to come up with some comprehensive model for this facilitation. Am I getting that right?
That's right. Yeah, something in those areas. Yeah, very much so.
So yeah, no, I just wanted to tell you, I think that's a really, really important thing, a very difficult thing, but very important thing to do, to try and get a grasp. Every conflict, every situation is going to be different, but it's so good to have a kind of, I know we will not be able to come up with a real checklist and just go, okay, let's go down the list and everything is sorted. But it is good to make an effort towards getting, some kind of grip on what are the basic things that you always, or the basic questions maybe that you always need to ask in order to have this comprehensive, or like you said, even holistic approach. And I would be very interested, not only to the outcome, but I would also be very interested to think along with you and contribute to that process with whatever means that I can, because I really, really think that's a really important effort to make right now, especially. So thank you.
Thank you, Marlon. I'll definitely contact you on that, because I could use some really experienced UN staff as well, sort of experience of that, because one of the things I also feel, we were talking about perspectives and impartiality, neutrality, etc. And particularly in the Myanmar conflict I was involved with, that the UN often gets a bad name for certain things, perspectives and perceptions that people have. But UNHCR and the World Food Programme have been amazing, actually, to be honest, in that particular context. UNHCR is a very difficult position, and it tries its very best to do what it can. The World Food Programme has been outstanding, working in really tough areas like Rakhine, where they've had not only a typhoon, but they've also had the conflict as well. And yet they're still delivering stuff. They're still managing to bring those different parties together, but they're having bricks thrown at them all the time because, oh, you shouldn't have given aid through this, you shouldn't have done it through that channel. But you've got to do it. I mean, sometimes this is the art of the possible. It's about saving people's lives, ultimately. If you don't do it, it doesn't happen. So I think sometimes that also is one thing, is how we work together. But also we've got to change the narrative. And people have got to understand that, you can't actually achieve everything that you want to achieve all the time. It just doesn't happen that way. So the narrative and who we are and what we do is very political. It's a very political narrative, but it needs to be out there. So we need to think through how carefully, because the UN is still a very incredibly important organization globally, and we need to make sure that is still recognized and understood, is my personal view. Noman, yeah.
Oh, sorry. We're over the time.
Sorry.
That's very German from participating in the country. I would say whoever wants, if that's okay with you, Ian, whoever wants to stay for a while, a bit longer, we can stay. And whoever has to go, I really appreciate you coming, participating, asking the questions. And Marlon, I really like your idea. I also agree that this checklist needs to start somewhere. So I will, if I just got an idea while you were saying it, and I will share it with you guys. If you have these ideas, share it with me. I can make a small infographic about what we learned today, and I can share it with you. Just ideas from our community about what we need to do in humanitarian mediation, and just share it with me. I will leave my email in the chat, and I would be very happy to receive your ideas. So thank you to those who have to leave, and I look forward to listen for a few more minutes to those who wants to stay.
Thanks, Mariana.